Today on Public Research.
I think that the best way to win the PR war is to win the real war. The reason Israel is losing the PR war is because it doesn't seem to be winning the real war. It fights and fights, and blood flows, and it's not close. It doesn't seem to be closer to victory than before. So what's the point? So is the point just causing civilian suffering? So win the real war. The headlines about Israel will never disappear, but there'll be many fewer. So the way to do it is to finish the war. Judaism is not a suicide pact.
A leading expert on the economy of the Soviet Union, Professor of Economics Vladimir Kontorovich of Haverford College, the author of The Destruction of the Soviet Economic System, An Insider's History, and Reluctant Cold Warriors, on what brought about the USSR's collapse, how the Soviet Union created much of the modern anti-Zionist movement in the 1970s and 80s, the trauma of 1990s Russia, and a discussion of the state of the Gaza War, rising anti-Semitism, and the future of the U.S.-Israel alliance. You're an eminent scholar of the Soviet economy. You're one of the leading economists of command and control economies. Can you give a little bit of your background to start out?
I studied economics in the Soviet Union. Then I came to the United States in 1977 and went to the University of Pennsylvania, where I got my PhD in economics. And that's it. I did some consulting work for the government. And my only job in this country was teaching economics at a small liberal arts college.
Am I mistaken I believe I heard that you, better than a lot of people in America, sort of saw the collapse of the Soviet Union?
Did you hear it from my son?
I'm, people
Well,
say.
I don't know. Actually, well, I was, some other people with whom I was discussing it at the time saw the process that Gorbachev started as destructive. And I vividly remember how my uncle, who is a plumber, not an economist, he's a plumber, also an immigrant from the Soviet Union, he was visiting me in 1986 or 87, and I had subscriptions to Soviet newspapers all the time. And he just looked through the newspapers and said, if they continue allowing this stuff, the country will fall apart. So my uncle, the plumber, was one of the people who saw it clearly. It was clear that the processes were, so it wasn't preordained. It could have been stopped. The destructive processes could have been stopped. And I remember discussing it with a colleague in 89, and I said, oh, all my consulting for the Pentagon is going to go puff. And he said, no, don't worry. There's going to be a coup, and it will be reversed. He was a Sovietologist. So there was a coup, but it was too late and too little. So it fell apart. So I cannot say that I saw it disintegrating. So disintegration of the Soviet Union was a contingent event. If certain things didn't happen, it wouldn't disintegrate. North Korea, yeah. So there is no such thing as an unconditional forecast. Oh, it's going to disintegrate. Except in a very, very empty way that, well, eventually all things on earth disintegrate. But it, yeah, I think the correct diagnosis in the late 80s was it's on a dangerous track that may lead to rapid disintegration, but who knows? This may be reversed. It wasn't reversed.
So you saw glasnost? I'm going to pronounce it wrong.
Glasnost.
Yeah. Is that what you saw as destructive?
It it was, and not just that. Uh, so Gorbachev, so you have a system. You have a system where the person at the top is very, very powerful, and all what happens in the country depends very much on that person. Uh, and that particular person was relatively young, ambitious, and had the idea that he'll spur the growth, the development of the Soviet Union, that they we have the best system in the world. Why are we underperforming in this and that area? And for that purpose, and also we have a durable system. Why are we afraid to let people travel abroad? What are we afraid of? We have such a wonderful system. So he started removing the weight-bearing elements of the system one by one by one, and eventually it started disintegrating. And at that time, well, there were half-hearted attempts to stop the process, to restore some of the elements of the old system, but not enough. So there was no full counter-revolution. That, by the way, everyone expected. Everyone expected, say, in 88. What was it in 88 that I spoke to a university classmate of mine who was visiting from the Soviet Union, who was telling me how people are buying up new books and current editions of magazines because things previously unthinkable are being published, and people are buying them much faster than they can read them because they're stocking up, because everybody knows this thing will not last. They will put a stop to it. So we'll have stuff to read for the next 20 years. So that was quite a common expectation. It was a reasonable expectation. But that didn't work out.
What were I'm just curious, some of those specific load-bearing elements you mentioned?
So I think he tried to to destroy all of them. So with this word with pronunciation of which English speakers struggle, glasnost, which is opening up the flow of information, was destructive. Not immediately, but it undermined the legitimacy of the regime. The regime had a story that was obligatory. And making things obligatory works. People don't have any alternatives. So say by 1989, when people in a town start demanding something and gather in front of the party committee chairman wouldn't have what to tell them because the official press has junked all the official excuses and all the official reasons. People would laugh in his face. That played a role. No question. And some of the things that were allowed to be voiced had, well, some of them were about. So the and that's it was interesting to see how it unfolded, because it unfolded slowly in a very measured pace. At every point, every month, it was clear what is already allowed and what is still not allowed. And I don't think until 1990 everything was allowed in print. But okay, so that's one thing. Another just an example. In 1987, there was a Gorbachev reform of the economy. It was patterned on the reform of 1965, economic reform. The 1965 reform had certain destabilizing elements. So it was put in place. The party, the state observed the destabilizing elements and swiftly reversed them, reversed these, halted these elements of the reform. So there was a myth created at the time, both in the West and in the Soviet Union, that it was the bureaucracy that sabotaged 1965 reform, because it was supposed to give more independence to factory managers at the expense of the bureaucrats, the ministries. That was a myth. So Gorbachev subscribed to this myth, and he insisted on pushing through his 1987 reform, which was identical to 1965 reform. So all the destructive elements that in 66, 67 were taken care of were allowed to play out. This 87 reform had an added destructive element, that the workers, employees of a factory, were supposed to elect their managers, which is funny because the thing that destroyed Russian army in 1917 was the decree, the order adopted after February Revolution early on, that the soldiers should be electing their officers. That was the end. So clearly, managers started competing. Candidates for the position of the manager started competing for the favors from the showering workers with promises of various favors. That actually was reversed in 1990. That was obviously wrong. So that's another thing. There was a war announced on, so it was an administrative economy. It had to be administered. And one of the things that Gorbachev did was unleashing a media campaign against the bureaucracy. Who's the bureaucracy? It's the ministries that oversaw various branches of the economy. And the ministries were doing what they were supposed to do in that system, castigating them as bureaucrats and saying that all the bad things come from them, cutting their staff by 50%, merging them, splitting them. Clearly, I don't believe these people did much work in the final years, and they were the ones who made the economy tick. And the list is long.
So when you say destructive, I think of you as probably a more pro free market person, right? Yeah. So what do you mean? Because someone might be surprised that you're using the word destructive. Do you mean destructive to the Soviet Union, the maintenance of it, or do you mean destructive to the society in Russia, or both?
There was an economic market, so let's talk about the economy. There was an economic system that that had to be run in a certain way if you wanted goods to be delivered where they're supposed to be delivered or produced at all. It has its logic. If you just destroy this system, you're not creating a market. You're destroying a system. So, and the consequences of this were very drastic. I think people in the West, uh, joyfully observing the disintegration of the rival superpower, missed the degree of trauma that people suffered in the 90s, especially in the early 90s, when things stopped working. And in a modern society, with a fine division of labor, so much, well, the mechanism is intricate. You break it. Oh, when everybody starts going to their country houses and growing potatoes just to get by, that's bad. And
If
that's not really the beginning of the market. That's
so, let me ask you it this way: let's say you became the king of Russia, the dictator of Russia in 1988. What would you have done differently in the transitional? Let's say you were dictator for 20 years from 1988. What would you have
well,
done?
there. There's a huge literature on this now, and and there were countries who had less of a trauma. In the Soviet Union wasn't the only country that went through this transition. So there were ways. I think that uh, the rush to break everything down was misguided. It was misguided because there was no trust well, nobody trusted the old authorities not to restore the Soviet Union. So let's just break it so that we know they're not coming back. Then rebuilding something out of it was very difficult. Nobody knew what to do. Uh, and it took many years to overcome this trauma. I, I don't think we could. There were all sorts of rival programs and various claims about their benefits. Uh, I think doing it slowly, in any case, would have been better, but the system was given such a push that was doing it slowly was not an option.
Can I ask?
Except that, you could reverse. You can make coal miners go back into the mines, and you can, I don't know, but you can apply force and try to freeze it again, and then unfreeze slowly. There was no force to do that. Nobody, nobody was ready to give the order, and so it just first fall apart and was somehow rebuilt from the ruins at huge human cost. People who lived through it, people, especially older people with jobs, with careers, uh, I don't know what to compare this trauma to. It was painful to listen to them. Uh, and eventually, in a year or two or three or five, most other people found their place, and somehow it started working, for better or for worse. But it was bad, and it wasn't an economic thing. It was a general social disintegration with a burst of crime, with everybody looting government property, and again without the rules.
Yeah, I remember watching documentaries about it. And I couldn't believe what happened where they would what they turn these what's the name for it? Basically, everybody got these not coupons,
Yeah,
these like
voucher.
vouchers, like a share of the aluminum company or something, and then these people would just stand on the street and collect them by these smart guys who realized how to play the system. Um, I'm curious. This is a dumb question, but I'm going to ask it. If I'm a Soviet citizen in 1977, I have like a brilliant business idea. I don't know, for a shoe company or something. What was what was the system? What would I do? Did they allow that, or
No.
really?
And that was the mainstay of the system. No. So they were Marxists, and Marx said that private initiative, oh, he said private property, but he was a lawyer. He emphasized property. So basically, private initiative is the root of all evil. And a society without private initiative will be more orderly and more technically dynamic, technologically dynamic, and overall better. So private initiative, so the best you could do, you could try to persuade people running government-run shoe factories to adopt your brilliant idea. So if you can, yeah, you couldn't get rich of it.
Okay, so like let's say from 1950 to 1980, how many businesses started in the Soviet Union, would you say?
Okay. So there were some underground businesses in the consumer area. They operated with pilfered inputs and probably stolen equipment. And if they would get big, the people who ran them risked death penalty. If you do it really big, you can get a death penalty. So, and this is illegal. Legally, you could register as an artisan, pay taxes, and do your little thing in your home. Also, after the war, so the Soviet system, so it was an interesting mix of ideological dogma and pragmatism. So private initiative was bad, 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 bad. And capitalism was bad because of private property. And the Soviet Union was good because it banished it. But when necessary, they would give some leeway to private initiative. So after World War II, and I believe until the end of 50s, there was a curious animal called cooperatives in the consumer goods area, in consumer good industries, that had much, well, they were still supervised and regulated very strictly, but they had more leeway for their dealings. So it was some outlet for some degree of for the enterprising spirit. Very small scale, but it was felt by the consumers. Then it was closed down. The same with another example of that, collective farmers and state farm workers were allowed to have kitchen garden plots and maybe a cow or two. And the regulation here, and that was their private thing, they grew. The idea was they were supposed to feed themselves and their families, but they had surpluses, which they would take to the urban markets and sell. And that was important for the urban dwellers. So that was private initiative. Now, the extent of this market initiative, of private initiative, was always, well, was periodically adjusted. When the going was tough in the economy, they would be allowed more leeway with their private plots, with their kitchen garden plots. Then ideology will triumph again, and half of the plots will be cut in half, and your cow will be taken away, and things like that. So but it was on the scale of a modern economy, it was minuscule.
Yeah.
It wasn't a big deal.
What do you make of the there's especially a set X. I'm gonna say it wrong. A nostalgia for the Soviet visuals, the statues and stuff. And I'll tell you, I find the statues and some of the artwork inspiring. What do you make of that?
Okay, I find some artwork from any era can be inspiring. Medieval art, good, why not? Uh, reliefs on Inca pyramids, what? Wonderful, interesting. So there is clearly, well, so you live in a huge country that is a superpower, and you are fed optimistic propaganda. And then you're told, actually, this country is a mass murderer of its own citizens, and you live very poorly for your level of education and qualifications compared to the rest of the world, and your country falls apart. And it's no longer, so it gets smaller physically. It's physically smaller. Lots of what used to be your country is now abroad. So it's a huge change. Well, I spoke to well before the fall of the Soviet Union, a British colleague or two were explaining to me how the British feel of people older than me, people who remember being citizens of the empire, and then it all shrinks. So that's one thing. Another thing is people are nostalgic for their. Was it in the New York Times that there was an article how based on East German interviews that East German women had better sex lives under communism? Yeah, of course they were 30 years younger.
But even among young Americans who obviously did not grow up in the 1950s Soviet Union, there's this attraction.
There is something. I don't know.
Yeah.
So
Right.
I taught a course called Soviet System, mostly the economy, but to explain the economy, you have to explain the political setup. And well, sometimes students would ask me, if it was the way you say it was, why are so many of our classmates enamored into it? So I don't know.
Right.
So yeah.
As a pivot, the role of the Soviet Union in spurring a lot of this anti-Zionist stuff we still see is very interesting to me. It's forgotten by many. I was reading about the creation of Zionology in the USSR. Do you know
Yeah,
what I'm talking?
there were experts. I don't remember the term, and so everything, the output of these people was poisonous, and I wouldn't touch it then or now. But yes, so the way Soviet media treated Israel in the 70s and 80s, first early 80s, of course, under Gorbachev it flipped. So Israel, sometimes you'd read the newspaper, and Israel would be an enemy on the par with the United States. So United States is clearly the leader of the capitalist camp, and it's big, and it's a rival. But Israel is small, but no, it's equally bad. So that it was totally disproportionate. People were wondering. I remember conversations. Yeah, it's just their religion being against Israel in our conversation there. Why? What's the big deal there? Uh, it is strange. Well, yeah,
One
that's
of the Have you
Yeah.
s- One of the most scariest images I've ever seen in my life is this image from the 1972 May Day parade. I don't know if you know this, of this Jewish.
Every city had its own May Day
Oh,
parade.
I
So
think it was the Moscow one, but it's basically this giant Jewish spider, and he has these huge arms, and he's like over the world, and it's like a horrifying. And I'm trying to track down like video of that, if there's any video of it, because it's so shocking. Have you seen
yeah.
that before?
Well, so there were several outlets for art like that. There was a satirical periodical, Crocodile, that would have that. Caricatures of capitalists and Zionists. And then there were specialized books on. So the famous book was Careful Zionism, Handle with Care, Zionism. Uh, so anti-Zionist, anti-Israel books that would have illustrations that were pretty nasty. Yeah. So I
Um,
saw these books and I saw the illustrations, and I didn't expect from them anything
yeah.
decent. So, yeah, they were bad.
And they created like a organization of Soviet Jews to denounce Israel, right? Or
That was marginal, yeah. That
okay.
was so periodically, uh, they would, as an organization, well, yeah, there was a committee with prominent Jews, and anyway, prominent Jews were periodically asked to sign one or the other petition against Israel. Decent people tried to absent themselves. Uh, there were anti-Israel meetings condemning Israeli aggression at workplaces. I mostly remember jokes and folklore making fun of it. So there is a poem by a prominent Soviet playwright who turned dissident about a rally at a factory where the shock worker, the worker who works best, is supposed to deliver a speech against Israel, and by mistake, the party hack gives him a speech, text of the speech written for a woman. But you just read what you're given. What do you know about? What do you care? So he reads, as a woman, I'm against. Uh,
That's good. That
it's
could
yeah.
still
So
work.
Russian speakers know this story well.
That could still work in an American context. So let's move to the, if you don't mind, let's move
No?
to the present day. Look, I don't want to ask a leading question, so I'll just put the ball in your court. The state of world Jewry, American Jewry, Israel. It's, in June we had the Iranian 12-day war. A lot of Jews sort of were on a sugar high then. We're in a different place now in late July. Sort of darker. France, England just said they're going to recognize a Palestinian state, et cetera, et cetera. How do you see the state of affairs?
Oh, I think I see it optimistically. So what did President Trump say about Macron? Uh,
He's a nice guy or
he's a
something.
nice guy. Doesn't matter what he says. Doesn't matter what he says. What matters is facts on the ground. What matters the most is facts on the ground. Of course, everything matters, but facts on the ground matter the most. Uh, the for now, the strategic situation in the Middle East has been transformed massively in favor of Israel. Uh, I remember 30 years of conversations with friends. What do we do with friends and just with acquaintances? Okay, what do we do about Iran? What do we do about the bomb? So whatever was going on Macron could have been kissing Israel, or French president could have been the friend with it, but Iran was making a bomb. And what do you do against the bomb? So this was always for me and for people I know, uh, the something on the horizon that you always remember, uh, and you don't know what to do about it, and there is no way, seems to be no way of dealing with it. And now it was massively shattered, and and turns out you can just do things, as they say on Twitter, and it works, and it works. Uh, so that, that was great. What happened to Hezbollah was great. We remember a year ago, oh, Hezbollah has 150,000 missiles, and it can close down Israel for a year, and it can hit precisely all the critical sites. So this strategically, this is a different world. The anti-Israel attitudes elsewhere, as one of my sons said, Dublin is the new Damascus. Yeah, Dublin is the new Damascus, but okay, Dublin isn't going to be sending tanks and missiles, so it's okay. It's okay. As that's this exchange, this swap is fine. It's to Israel's advantage. Now, are there problems? Yeah, sure. There are always problems. So you win one war, and one enemy is defeated, there will always be another one.
You're, you're very optimistic. I noticed this. I admire it. I admire it.
You know what? People 20 years, well, my father's friends, and these people are disappearing one by one very fast. Their idea of Israel is still Israel surrounded by populous Arab states ready to send hundreds of thousands of soldiers to fight with Israel. And I kept telling them, no, that's gone. Nobody's sending tanks and hundreds of thousands of people fighting Israel. No, these countries are incapable of that. There are other threats. So Israel has come a long way. And in the last year, wow.
So this is good. We disagree a little bit on this, so I can push back a little bit. That's good.
Sure.
So wouldn't you? What if I said to you, "This is sort of everything you said's true, but it's sort of like there's two sides to this Israeli government. There's the brilliant government that did the Iran operation, that did the Lebanon operation, and then when we look at Gaza, obviously it's more difficult because you have hostages, but that they haven't been as brilliant as smart there. I mean, do you think, for instance, that Gideon's chariot, this and it was worth a try, but I mean, at this point, Hamas seems more emboldened. Do you think that's been a failure? Do you think that the Netanyahu needs to regroup and change strategy dramatically?
So even if we leave aside the catastrophic event of October 7, 93, just the conduct of war after that looks very, very inefficient. And from what I can understand, from what I read, there are two reasons for that. One obvious reason, it's the war has two purposes, official purpose, and these purposes are mutually contradictory. They're mutually contradictory. So as a result of that, there are areas in Gaza where Israeli army hasn't gone once in this whole war. There are central camps where a lot of infrastructure is and a lot of fighters are, and Israelis haven't gone there even once, apparently because the hostages are there. Now, this can last forever. This can last forever. If this is such a binding constraint, then that. So we cannot really judge it. Oh, why can't they win? They cannot win because they hold one hand behind their backs because of the hostages, and it's a powerful domestic constraint. And okay, you can agree, disagree, say it's wrong, it's stupid, but that's what it is. So that's one thing. And another thing, and I'm not so sure, but some commentators, right? The army. So what about this story that the army clears one and the same area for the fifth time in the war? What is the strategy of raids? Isn't it wasteful? So one explanation that I see in the comments is that the army doesn't want to occupy Gaza. Its greatest fear is to be responsible for Gaza's sewage system. Okay, so that's a constraint, and that makes prolongs the war, makes it interminable. I was surprised. When was it? In March, I was in Israel and spoke to a fellow who was in Yahalom, the tunnel unit, and asked him what percentage of tunnels has been destroyed. And he gave me a low percentage. And then I saw in the media a different percentage, but still less than 50%. So most of the tunnels are still operating. And he told me, oh, some tunnels are easy we withdraw and they reconstruct them. So that can take a long time because of these constraints. So the question is Israel right to is Israeli government right to observe these constraints or not? I don't know. That's a separate question.
I wonder, as an economist, have you ever heard of Eric Weinstein? He works for Peter Thiel. He's a mathematician.
Yeah, well, I saw the name.
Okay, he did an interview very early on in the war, and he loves Israel.
The right thing to have done, in my opinion, is very simple. We have a schedule. You're interested in rape? Here's how many acres we will annex. You interested in murder? You interested in blowing up families? Here's the schedule of the acreage that you will lose. We will have an annexing ceremony, and we will name it after your victims. And it'll be permanently a part of Israel. And so that way, when you do something to us where you're begging us to kill you and your children, to blow up your buildings, to bulldoze your houses, we're not going to fall for it anymore. What we're going to do is we're going to have a ribbon cutting ceremony. And what we're going to see is a larger and larger and larger state of Israel as your moronic death cult continues to grind against innocent life. So rather than have a single death, you're going to have a transfer of acreage. I'm trying to say that in this cycle of violence, what is sought by the architects of murder, misery, and horror is reprisal. Physical, kinetic reprisal. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm saying deny them that. Look, you've got a terrible situation, okay? This is a completely different sort of an enemy. And my claim is the story of Israel exercising power over Arabs who are not Israeli citizens is a cancerous story. And if Israel does not figure out how to get out of that story, even to the point where it's got a state that it has to go up against in a war, Israel is being induced into a game theory according to the local rules of the Middle East and then broadcast into a somewhat anti-Semitic West. This is the strategy of the Arabs in this situation. It's just how to get Israel to play by local rules of the Middle East for export into a sophisticated somewhat, mildly anti-Semitic West for people, particularly on the left, who don't particularly like Jews and want to be engaged in some sort of recapitulation of the civil rights era or South African apartheid.
And he said that what Hamas and the Gazans did on October 7th is they tried to do, have you heard the term suicide by cop?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. He said they were doing something equivalent to October 7th by cop or something, where basically Hamas wanted to lure Israel into pounding Gaza, and them having footage of dead children, and that it would destroy Israel's image globally. Not that it was ever great, and that 2 years of having Israel and dead children in people's news feeds, that's what they wanted. And he was basically concerned that Israel was going to fall into that trap. And one thing he had proposed, well, it's sort of my variation, is that, or I'll put it this way. Imagine if after October 7th, Israel had just taken the Rafah crossing and had said to Hamas, every month you keep the hostages, we're going to take 1% of Gaza, 3.65 square kilometers. We're going to have a dedication ceremony, raise Israeli flag permanently. It's ours. We're going to dedicate it to October 7th victim. And just said, okay, month after month, we're just taking more and more. Would that have been smarter?
Okay, so there are a couple of things here. First, in history, figuring out who wanted what is a very difficult thing. The motives of behavior in personal relations and in society in general, in history. So I don't know, Israel has captured a lot of Hamas internal documents. Maybe they will be revealing, or maybe not, because in centralized systems, the top guy knows what he wants, but he's not telling anyone, and that's it. So to give you an example from the Soviet example, before World War II, the Soviet Union was developing huge armed forces. It had more tanks than everyone else on Earth combined, more fighter planes than everyone else more submarines, for God's sake. And they were building an ocean-going navy in the 30s when people were dying of hunger. And they were already building all the tanks, which at least makes sense for a landlocked country. But ocean-going navy, and they aspire to have a navy like British, like American, like French, like great maritime powers. What were they doing it for? Interesting question. So the admiral, the Navy man who oversaw the program, lived long, outlived Stalin, and wrote his memoirs. And in the memoirs, he raises this question: what was the strategic concept for that? And this admiral says, and he was generally a plain-spoken man and kind of trustworthy, and he had nothing to fear because it was after Stalin. He wrote, he could have invented some pro-Soviet thing, but he just said there was a strategic concept, but only Stalin knew what it was. So the commander of the Navy didn't know what the Navy was for. And it was built and at immense cost, proved to be useless during World War II, had to be cut into scrap to supply steel mills during the war. So what Sinwar wanted, I don't know, maybe we'll learn from all the documents recovered, or maybe not. I'm not holding my breath. So that's one thing. Another thing is would cutting 1% of territory every month do it? I don't know. That's another kind of putting pressure on Hamas. So if Israel doesn't want to occupy Gaza and doesn't want to be responsible for the managing the sewer system, but if you annex 1% every month, eventually you have to take responsibility for civil affairs. And this is what Israel is trying to avoid now.
Oh, let me clarify. Don't annex any land with people. Just the land, no Gazans.
Yeah, but that's a densely populated place. Eventually, if you do it long enough, no, you can do arithmetic. There is so much empty land. Eventually, many months have. So how many months?
It would have been
24?
Israel would have now had permanently annexed like 18%, let's say 17% of Gaza.
Okay, empty. All of it just empty. So this doesn't interfere with Hamas functioning at all?
What do you mean? Oh, you
Hamas
think they would
stays
still be there?
Yeah, why not?
Oh, well, look at Rafah. It's pretty much destroyed, right? I mean,
okay, but it's just 18%. You leave 80% for them. Still, after 2 years. And all of these tricks, clever ways of doing things, they all presume that Israel has infinite time to do what it's doing, and it doesn't. What? No, time is running out. Trump will say stop. The government will fall, and some idiot some God knows what coalition will come in its place. So, no.
do you agree with me that
There is no reason to draw it out. This reminds me of Iranian story. So for 30 years, people were coming up with clever ways to stop the nuclear project. And I remember my friends in the synagogue I was going at the time, 15 years ago, say, Vladimir, for next Shabbat, you bring us the way of stopping the nuclear project. And I was thinking and raking my mind, and eventually I realized there is only one way. No clever way does it. You have to hit them hard. You have to bomb it, which is eventually we had to do. So I think the way to win in Gaza is to go. If we want to win and destroy Hamas, we have to go by foot in and do it the old-fashioned way, as it always has been done. And that will work. Everything else is iffy, prolonged, uncertain, and so far hasn't worked.
Okay, but would you agree with me that the whole playing games with the aid, I think we can now say that's failed?
Yes.
Okay. So basically you think be tougher, hit them.
The usual military way. Imagine that you live in pre-1960 world. How countries were deciding these issues then. Well, everybody understood how you do it. You go in and dirt your hands, lose your people, you lose your soldiers, but that's how you do it. No way to do it otherwise.
Do you think it was a mistake not to, let's say in October 2023, Israel moved out women, children, elderly into a temporary camp in Israel proper, let's say, so that the world wouldn't see images of dead kids? Do you think that would have been wise?
Can you really take a society, 1.5 million, separate? Can you really separate and make sure that Hamas fighters wouldn't infiltrate, and then you have to bomb the same women and children? I know. It's another clever trick.
A lot of people believe that Israel fights two different wars, right? There's the war of bullets, the casualty amounts, and then there's a PR war, a global legitimacy war.
Yes.
And some people are worried that maybe Israel can win the bullet war but in the long run, it will lose because being in the headlines for 2 years and people seeing all this, dead kids and stuff is going to sow. I mean, here's what concerns me, and you actually have a good perspective on this because you teach college students. There's something
used to teach.
Yeah. There's something very scary about when I think about what is it doing to this generation of Americans to have not just Israel, but to have Jews in the center of our politics for 2 years. That's such a amount of time where people are sort of forming their identities around that. I'm very concerned about that.
I think that the best way to win the PR war is to win the real war. The reason Israel is losing the PR war is because it doesn't seem to be winning the real war. It fights and fights and blood flows and nothing. And it's not close. It doesn't seem to be closer to victory than before. So what's the point? So is the point just causing civilian suffering? So win the real war. The headlines about Israel will never disappear, but there'll be many fewer. So the way to do it is to finish the war.
That's what Ben-Gurion said. Yeah, one of his dictums, right? Do you have thoughts though on what I talked about what the state of anti-Semitism? I mean, and you actually said it earlier, but I noticed it after October 7th. There is something about the anti-Israel movement that is very much like a secular religion. It's almost religious. What do you make of it when you look at that movement? I'll put it this way. Can you tell me you weren't on campus during October? You're retired?
Yeah.
Okay.
As my friends tell me, oh, you retired in time.
Okay, so just tell me, were you surprised by the instant? I mean, they were instantly accusing Israel of genocide in October. Were you surprised by that?
Okay, so I was less surprised than some of my American friends because I always take anti-Semitism. There's a latent anti-Semitism out there. There should be no illusions. Westerners are nice people. They try not to manifest it in rude forms, but it's there. And it will be reappearing from time to time. Yeah, but of course, when you start thinking that this outbreak is caused by the massacre of the Jews, this defies even my imagination. Yeah, that's difficult to process.
Do you have any thoughts on the amount of Holocaust inversion you see in this movement?
People, the story with the Holocaust, I just think Holocaust became such a mentioning Holocaust, referring to Holocaust, studying Holocaust became a routine thing. And when something becomes a routine thing that you are fed, people miss the uniqueness and the enormity of that. And it's another dogma that the authorities think we should learn. And it's not interesting. And it's not about us, and it's not interesting. So I think when I see public discourse, a lot of Jews are still used to the environment when saying, "Oh, this is anti-Semitic," was effective, and then it stopped being effective. It stopped being effective, and people still say, "Well, but that's borderline anti-Semitic." Okay, so it's not effective. It doesn't work, this argument. The same way the references to Holocaust have been worn out. Worn out. They were used very intensively. Okay, that's the end of it. New arguments are needed.
It did strike me because it was this rising anti-Semitism. It was surging even before October 7th. People forget that now. You know, you have this Kanye West thing that was all before October 7th. But it is funny how, like clockwork, as the last Holocaust survivors die, we see this basically new form of Nazism just come surging back. Right.
Well, I would necessarily call it Nazism because it's an old thing. So Nazism was about many more things than just anti-Semitism.
Right.
Uh, Anti-Semitism takes different forms, different societies, different times. Oh yeah, it's back. It's back. And you can say that the way American Jews lived from the 60s through the 80s or 90s was a golden age that's exceptional in Jewish history. Why? What right do we have to expect that the exceptional will continue? It's exceptional if you take historical precedent, historical trends. So the golden age is over.
I haven't heard people mention this, but I have a theory about why we're seeing such an upsurge of anti-Semitism in America, which is that as America becomes more diverse, the far right is becoming more diverse, okay? And so what is now the binding glue that unites a Muslim from whose origins from Egypt and a half Hispanic guy and Asian guy, and they all want to be, part of the far right, right? It can't be racism anymore as much. It's got to be, okay, we all hate the Jews. At least we can agree on that, because yeah. What do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that immigrants from countries with very high levels of endemic anti-Semitism bring it with them, and you can see it just by reading the accounts of student disturbances and things like that. Who are the leaders? The leaders are disproportionately immigrants or children of immigrants from Muslim countries. And that's what they learn in their schools, their religious schools. That's what their parents teach them. So yeah, that's a specific element of this upsurge. Yes, both here and in Europe and Canada and Australia, wherever these people go. So that's a foreseeable and preventable part. And one could see what was going on in France a couple decades ago with the rise of anti-Semitism fueled by the immigrants. American Jews didn't see it. So for American Jews, immigration is a sacred cow. You cannot touch it. Jewish organizations are all for it. So we are getting to French or British level.
Let me ask you a hard question. Is the Occam's, I'll just make a argument my right-wing Israeli friend would make. The Occam's razor history of the Israel-Arab conflict is this. They fought the war of 1948. This entire conflict is basically the result of not decisively ending that war, the way World War II was ended, the way, the partition of India and Pakistan was ended, and that sort of, through the 67 war, creating these two limbo regions of Gaza, the West Bank, that are sort of in and out, nobody's really sure what they are, has kept basically the war of 1948 on a slow burner, where it's, basically the Palestinians still think they're in it. They still think they can turn this game around and win. And fundamentally, what my friend was said is they should have just bit the bullet in 1967 and had these people become Egyptians, become Jordanians, and decisively ended it, even if it would have hurt Israel's standing. And that basically that's the situation. Israel's stuck in this sort of no-win situation.
Israel wanted to give Gaza back to
Yeah.
Egypt. Egypt wasn't taking.
Yeah.
No, nobody wanted to talk back then. In 67, there was no one to talk to. And it took a couple of decades to get people to talk to Israel. So I'm not sure.
Oh, yeah.
Also, I think that there is another point of view that says that for Muslim people, creation of a non-Muslim, and especially Jewish state on the territory that was previously ruled by the Muslims is intolerable. It was intolerable in the 19th century, was intolerable in 1920, in 1936, in 1948, and it continues to be intolerable. So it's, well, I don't know how more final could 48 be.
Well, my friend basically would say do more population transfer. That's probably
population transfer. It's not clear why population transfer would stop hostility, because all this population would be housed in the neighboring countries, wouldn't be allowed to assimilate, would be put into camps and trained and educated to fight Israel.
But they wouldn't have the high ground above Ben Gurion Airport.
High ground, yeah, okay. High ground, Gaza doesn't have high ground, but still.
Not Gaza, no.
Is a big, so Gaza doesn't have high ground. High ground is a small part of the problem, I think. It's just the hostility.
Okay.
The desire to go back to, I don't know, Ottoman times when there were no Jews.
The problem is, though, right, the world knows the two-state narrative. They know that. They don't know any other alternative narrative. So what does Israel do? Are they just stuck in this terrible no-win situation? What?
I don't know why it's a no-win situation. Israel has been growing handsomely, getting richer, getting more populous, getting stronger, beating up its enemies. Israel is doing very well by the world standards. So, but Israel, at the same time, Israel has this problem, which we don't know how to solve. So, an Israeli friend taught me a wise principle. If you don't know how to solve a problem, don't try to solve it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Live with it. Live with it. Meanwhile, grow your strength.
Do you
become and on this front, Israel has a lot to do because it's a split society. There are all sorts of problems with its internal organization, both economic and political, and many problems to solve internally. Work on it. Don't try to solve the problem for which you don't see a solution.
Do you agree with me that what should be one of Israel's top priorities is growing more self-reliant, preparing for the possibility of a much weaker or possibly losing, the Israel-U.S. alliance, with a president, AOC?
Yeah, that's non-controversial. Israel supposedly is doing this, trying to strengthen its military industry, which is pretty good as it is, and increase the stocks. There are natural limits to this. With military technology as complicated as now, you need to be part of the world economic cooperation to build these things. You can hold only so much inventory. Inventory is expensive, and inventory gets obsolete. So yeah, Israel should have more than it has now. Certainly, Israel can increase its capacity for 150 millimeter artillery shells or simple things. With things like ballistic missile interceptors, which are terribly expensive and terribly sophisticated, and the United States doesn't have enough of those. So I think it's unrealistic for Israel to. Well, and yeah, it's good to move in this direction, but there is no hope of being self-sufficient. Nobody's self-sufficient.
I'm sure you're aware that the young in America, left and right, are increasingly anti-Semitic. I have a very bad feeling about it, in both parties, by the way. Do you think in 10 years, if you had to put your money on it, how strong will the U.S.-Israel alliance be?
So if you look at survey data of American support for Israel, the Republican support holds pretty steady at 70 or 80%. And the Democratic support has been drifting downward. Nobody knows. New generations come. The world changes. Agendas change. People change their views. People grow up. I don't know. Well, the trends so far haven't been nice, but what's going to be there in 10 years, have no idea. Nobody really understands how these things.
I just can't. I can't alarm you, no matter how much I try to infect you with my fears. You're just the super optimist. Well,
we've seen so many bad things that so I'll tell you why. One of my sons, before he made Aliyah, when he was in America, he would used to panic at every piece of bad news about Israel. So I developed a whole arsenal of explanations and rationalizations. I would always say, but in year so and so and so, it was so much worse. And look, it all turned out good. So, with historic analogies and parallels and things like that. So yeah, I had like 10 years of this training. Then he went to Israel and stopped worrying.
Okay, then as we wrap up, help alleviate one fear of mine, because here's what I hear from the anti-Israel people. Basically, their dream is we're gonna give Israel the Rhodesia treatment. Support among Democrats is cratering. Look at the right. Tucker Carlson is this anti-Semite, hates Israel. Candace Owens, Joe Rogan, the biggest podcast, anti-Israel. We got the young Republicans. It's only a matter of time. The U.S. alliance will be destroyed, and then Israel will be totally isolated. We'll give it the Rhodesia treatment. Alleviate my mind on that.
Israel is not a Rhodesia. Israel is a country of 10 million with advanced industry and advanced science and technology that really, with people who have nowhere to go and intend to stay. And well, look, Israel was created against the will of the superpowers. The British were all on the side of Israel's neighbors, invading neighbors, and supplied officers for their armies. And Britain was a mighty superpower back in 1948. And up until 1956, Britain was considering a military operation against Israel, or making a corridor for Egypt to go to Saudi Arabia. Oh, well, Israel found a friend in France. The United States didn't want to have anything to do with Israel. So France helped. Then de Gaulle stopped, de Gaulle put a halt to relations with Israel. America started appreciating Israeli might and took a new ally in the Cold War. One door closes, another door opens. And the important thing is to be an internally strong country that by the way has nuclear weapons, but also can do a lot of things. Can do secret operations, supplies God knows how much of American intelligence and other valuable things. Israel is a valuable ally, and actually it's the military and the intelligence people in the United States who value Israel the most because they know what they are getting.
You posted about Peter Beinart and Jon Stewart. I want to just get your take on this Peter Beinart thing because he's a big Pied Piper of the anti-Zionist.
You know, you bring up such an interesting point because it does cut to the idea of who qualifies as a good Jew and a bad Jew. And admittedly, I don't know all the different things in the nuance of the history here or what happened in '93 at the agreement that might have turned, but I know what I'm seeing. And I have a moral clarity about what I'm seeing. And what I'm seeing, I think, as someone who was raised in Judaism, that's what taught me that this is wrong. What happens when David becomes Goliath? Is that what troubles you?
Yeah, I mean, our responsibility is to remember what was done to us, to remember what we would have wanted people around the world. I'm not saying that what's happening in Gaza is the equivalent of the Holocaust, but what's happening in Gaza is bad enough.
It may be a slow, you know, I saw an article in the Times, Bret Stephens, I think, and his argument was this can't be a genocide because Israel's so strong they could kill them much quicker.
Right.
And I thought, well, that's the most cynical description of a military siege and a purposeful starvation that I've ever seen in my life.
Right. I mean, even Israel's leading human rights organization, B'Tselem, has just come out with a report saying they believe this is genocide. So it seems to me, if we want to remember our history, if we want to honor those in our own families and of our people who were slaughtered and who were genocided, who were starved to death while nobody in the world cared, our obligation is to care. Our obligation is to risk something.
Listen, man. This has rocked my. I feel like a crazy person.
No, it's not serious. The use of the word genocide immediately disqualifies the speakers. There's no genocide. Israeli army is very careful in choosing its targets. There are a bunch of lawyers who approve the targets. It's over-lawyered, and it's very careful about avoiding civilian casualties. Civilians die in wars, and it's regrettable, but they die in every war. Here, with the terrain, Israel didn't start this war. Israel didn't choose it, but for its survival, it needs to win this war, and it's being careful. That's one of the reasons it lasts for 2 years. It's lasted for 2 years. The demands on Israel by people like Beinart and this other guy. I don't watch TV, so I don't know the other guy.
Jon Stewart.
Okay. The demands are unprecedented. No country fighting a war has ever been required to feed the enemy population. Feeding the enemy population is the obligation of the enemy. Of course, Hamas was very successful in turning the tables and absolving itself of responsibility for its own population, actually making it a bunch of human shields. So there is a cynical strategy by Hamas that these people that works on these people.
What do you make of the claim that you're betraying Judaism?
No, Judaism is not a suicide pact. Again, well, I have a distant cousin who is whose military specialty is choosing the targets for the aircraft, and he has endless stories when he carefully chose a target where no civilians are present, and then the lawyers review it, military lawyers, and said, no, you cannot, because this can happen or that can happen. Nobody does it this way. The United States doesn't do it this way. Nobody does it this way. So it's a new international law new law of war is invented specifically for Israel. Anyone who knows anything about any war, who's ever spoken to combatants, yeah, people die, people starve, people die. On the winning side, civilians die and starve. It's regrettable, but what's the alternative? What's the alternative? Do these two guys have an alternative for Israel? What is Israel to do? Give Hamas the keys to the house?
Right. Whenever Spain or Ireland criticize Israel, I always ask them, okay, do you want to take over the hostage effort? Do you want to take it over? How about your military comes in and handles it? It's like, oh, you don't even have a military. Okay. Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasant conversation.